This morning, we're going to be wrapping up our series, Undo. And over the last 2 weeks, we have really been looking at things in our lives that we wish we could undo. Those things, if we could go back in time, we would undo some of the things that we've said or some of the things that we have done. Now, all of us know that we don't have that ability. Like, we cannot go back in time to undo things. But what we can do is we can begin to put some practices in place that would help us be the kind of people that have less of these moments, that we can live lives that we don't need to undo. And the whole basis of this series was really some words by James, the brother of Jesus. And this is what James said to the early church. He would say these words in James chapter 1, verse 19. He would say, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger." That this word, even though that James wrote this many years ago, still has a ton of application in our lives today. And that we would have to undo a whole lot less in our lives if we could begin to live out some of these practices. To be quick to listen. Now, this is just a side note. 2 weeks ago when I taught this message, that afternoon I was at home and my wife was trying to talk to me, and I was kind of multitasking. I was listening to her, and I was on my phone, and she literally paused, got my attention, and she said, "Do you plan on actually doing the things that you told everyone else to do as a part of your message?" Yes. This is the life of a pastor. Last week we talked about being slow to speak. And literally, what if we allowed space and time to truly hear what someone's coming from, but also when we do speak, that we speak words of hope and of life into other people. And so if you didn't get a chance to hear either of those messages, I'd encourage you to go online to lakesawyerchurch.org, and you can catch up those two messages as part of the series or any other messages that we've done this year. But this morning, we're going to talk about this last bit here, being slow to anger. And as we talk about anger, I think it's probably important, just as we get going, to kind of differentiate between two kinds of anger. The first kind of anger is what I would call righteous anger. And righteous anger can be a healthy form of anger. Righteous anger comes from when you see an injustice in the world, or you see an atrocity that's happening, and you're compelled to do something about it. You're compelled to be part of the solution, that there's an anger that builds in you, and you want to fix the issue. And we've kind of talked about this as a church. We've asked the question, what is it that breaks your heart? And whatever it is that breaks your heart, identify and do something about it. Righteous anger was something that was a motivator for Jesus. You constantly see Jesus seeing what's happening to people or what people are going through, and he wants to come alongside and change their circumstance, change their situation. The other form of anger is what we're going to call unrighteous anger. And unrighteous anger is never a healthy form of anger. Unrighteous anger isn't rooted in anything good. It's not about seeing atrocities in this world and wanting to make a difference. Unrighteous anger is truly rooted in our own arrogance, in our own pride. And the reality is all of us deal with this form of anger. All of us have this emotion, this unrighteous emotion that wells up in us, and it literally explodes onto some of the people that we care most about, the people that we love the most. We can look back in our lives and see moments in time where unrighteous anger got the best of us. And the truth is, it's often over the most ridiculous things in hindsight. I think about a time for me when I was in high school, and I'll never forget it. It was kind of like a normal week, but this weekend, my dad had a list of chores that I had to get done. And I felt like he was being completely unreasonable, that he would expect me to contribute as a part of the family. But sure enough, like, that's what I had to do. Like, I could go do whatever I wanted with my friends as long as I got my list of chores done. And so just right off to the get-go, I was not in a good place. Like, I was not feeling happy about this. Like, I felt like there was an injustice, this was an atrocity, and I should just be able to go do whatever else I wanted to do. But my dad would not relent, and he required me. He said, "Son, you got to do these chores before you can go about your day." And so I started doing some of the things, taking out the trash, doing the dishes, straightening up the downstairs, and my buddy Simon came over. And Simon and I, that day, we had planned to go to the beach, and so we were kind of excited about it. And so Simon, when he showed up, he was ready to go, but I told him, I said, my dad's making me do all these things. And so Simon, being a typical high schooler, he didn't offer to help, which is what you should do, just in case you're wondering. you should offer to help. Simon went up to my room and started playing video games as I continued to do chores. And eventually I got to my room. It was the last thing that I had to get done before we could head out. And I was trying to straighten up the room around him, but he was just in the way constantly. And again, I could feel this anger, it was boiling up inside of me. And I was frustrated at my dad. I was frustrated at Simon, and it was not a good moment for me. And the one thing I had to do before I would be completely finished is I had to vacuum my room. And so I remember I was vacuuming the room, and I came to where Simon's feet were on my floor, and he's such a kind guy. He actually lifted up his feet so I could vacuum where his feet were at, and he put his feet on a stool that was in my room that had a fan on it. And when he put his feet up on the stool, he accidentally knocked the fan, and it fell off the stool onto the ground. Now, not a big deal, but I lost it. I started screaming at him. I was so angry, I literally reared back and kicked the fan as hard as I can and went flying across the room. I bolted out of my room. I slammed the door behind me as I screamed going down the hallway. I don't know what happened in that moment, but again, it was just an emotional outburst, this unrighteous anger that just came out of nowhere and was just thrown on my buddy Simon. Now, I didn't get far down the hallway before I realized truly how ridiculous this was. And I walked back into the room and I apologized. Now, I would love to tell you that was the only time in my life that I've ever experienced moments of unrighteous anger. But that wouldn't be true. And, as I've gotten older, what I've realized is now those moments of unrighteous anger actually impact the people that I love the most. I look back, Simon, we're not even friends anymore. Our lives just went in different directions. That's one thing. But now when I have these outbursts, it's my wife, it's my kids. They're the ones who feel the effects of my anger. And I'm sure that's true of your life. When you find yourselves becoming overwhelmed with anger, it's often directed at the people that we love and care about the most. And it's those moments of unrighteous anger, those are the things that we wish we could go back and undo in our lives. Those are the things that we wish we would not continue to repeat. Those moments we look at our lives and we think, I know I can be better. I want to be better. I don't want to continue to do this each and every day of my life. This morning, as we continue to talk about anger, we're going to look at a passage out of the Old Testament, which is the first half of the Bible that tells us about the life of the people of Israel. And in there specifically, we're going to look at a book that is titled Jonah, and it's God's interaction with a man named Jonah. And depending if you've been involved in church, maybe you're familiar with the story of Jonah. Maybe this is the first time you will ever hear the story of Jonah, but it's an incredible story. Basically, God goes to Jonah, and he tells Jonah that he has a plan for his life, that what God needs Jonah to do is to go to Nineveh, to go to this people that God has called him to go to and to share a message that God has given him to share. Now, God's plan, God's direction here, it's pretty clear. Jonah, go to Nineveh. Jonah, share this message. All Jonah had to do was do what God was asking him to do. But this is actually how we see, this is how Jonah responded in Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 3. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. Jonah was like, I'm out. God, I want nothing to do with what you've called me to do. I don't want to be a part of this plan. It's just not resonating with Jonah. Matter of fact, what Jonah does is Jonah buys a ticket to board a ship. And he's thinking, I'm going to get on this ship, and what I can do is I can outrun God. It's crazy to think that Jonah really believed he could outrun God. He believed that he could go someplace that would be beyond God's control or God's reach. It's crazy that many of us think the same thing. As Jonah is aboard this ship, we're told that there's a great storm that begins to break out on the water. And undoubtedly in a great storm, the boat, the ship is tossed back and forth. And it's in this moment that you realize how powerful water can be, how powerful God is. And sure enough, this boat is being tossed all about. And the crew and the people on the boat begin to freak out. They begin to look like, what's going to happen? Are we going to be capsized? Is the whole thing going to sink? Are we going to crash somewhere? We are completely out of control. And so they hatch a plan. They think, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start throwing things overboard. We're going to take things that weigh a lot. We're going to throw it overboard because the ship will be lighter. And if the ship is lighter, then the ship will be more maneuverable. And maybe, just maybe, we can maneuver the ship to land. In that moment, perhaps we can be safe. So sure enough, they start taking things, they start throwing things overboard. Doesn't seem to matter how much they offload, they still can't steer the ship. And so they devise plan number 2. Plan number 2 is, look, here's what we want to do. Each and every one of you, you need to pray to your God. And ask your God, if your God is doing this, that he would relent. And so all the crew, they begin to pray to their gods, hoping that one of those gods has the power to cause the storm to relent. But even though they're praying, nothing changes. The storm doesn't relent. It continues to rage on. And so they think, okay, this makes a lot of sense. Let's play a game of craps. No, they don't really play craps. They play a dice game that is called lots. And so they begin to cast lots. And their hope is that as they cast lots, the dice would show them ultimately who's responsible for this storm. And so all the crew, they come around, they cast lots, and all the dice point to who? To Jonah. All of the dice point to Jonah. Now, where is Jonah when all this is happening? Jonah is beneath the ship, sound asleep. Like the dude has no idea what's going on. And so when they cast the lots, they find out that Jonah's responsible. They all go underneath, they wake Jonah up, and they're like, Jonah, this is your fault. You're responsible for this. You're the reason why this storm is raging on. Like, what are we going to do? What do you want us to do, Jonah? And this is what Jonah's response is. He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, that this great storm has come upon you. Jonah's like, guys, this is all my fault. Like, I got to own this. I'm the reason why this is happening. I'm the reason why you find yourself in a moment of turmoil. So here's the solution. Just take me and throw me overboard. And then if you throw me overboard, when I hit the sea, everything will be fine. And at first, the crew is like, no, we're not going to do that, Jonah. But the storm continues, so eventually it's exactly what they do. They pick up Jonah, they throw him overboard. And it's in this moment that we're told that Jonah is swallowed by a large fish. And what's interesting is it's in this moment that the trajectory or the course for Jonah begins to shift. Because up until this moment, Jonah was running from God. But in this moment, Jonah actually turns back to God. And it's there inside this fish that Jonah begins to pray a prayer of vulnerability, a prayer of struggle, and a prayer of hope. And at the end of the prayer, this is how Jonah wraps it up. These are his words. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. The first part, what Jonah is referring to, those who cling to worthless idols, he's referring to the people of Nineveh. That these are the people who cling on to their idols. They have turned away from God. Jonah seemingly has forgotten the fact that this is exactly what he did. That he himself turned his heart, his life away from what God was calling him to do. But in this moment, there is a change of heart for Jonah. And he says, look, I will shout with grateful praise to you. I will sacrifice to you, because Jonah has experienced firsthand from the depths of the ocean to the rescuing of his life that salvation comes from the Lord. This is an incredibly pivotal moment in Jonah's life. This is the moment that he realizes he can't turn away from God, and that he actually has to go and do the thing that God has called him to do. And so that's what we're told he does. We're told that Jonah makes the decision to go to Nineveh, to be the messenger that God asked him to be to begin with. And when he gets to Nineveh, he shares God's message. And for the people of Nineveh, this isn't a great message. He tells them, he says, hey, look, in 40 days from now, God is going to destroy your town. God is going to wipe out your life really functionally as you know it. Like everything about your experience is going to change in 40 days. If you think about it from Jonah's perspective, this is a pretty bold thing to do. He's risking a lot. He's coming to tell people, like, hey, I'm just the messenger. I just want you to know that this is what God says will happen to you. And when the people of Nineveh hear that message, they recognize their error. They recognize that they have turned away from God. They understand that they have clung to worthless idols in their life, and they don't want what's going to happen. And so the people of Nineveh begin to make changes. They begin to change the direction and the course of their life. The king of the people actually declares, he says, everyone, you must turn back to God. And the people of Nineveh do just that. They turn their lives away from their idols, and they turn it back to God. And this is what we read. This is God's response. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented. He did not bring on them the destruction that he had threatened. I mean, God sees what these people have done. He sees how they've reoriented their lives, how they're focusing on him. And what he decides to do, he says, look, I'm not going to do the thing that I said I was going to do. And of course, you have to imagine for the people of Nineveh, this is incredible news. Like, this is amazing. Like, we're not going to be destroyed. Like, our life is not going to end like we thought it was. Like, for everyone around, this has to be good news. Like, even for Jonah, you would think, like, Jonah, he's got this difficult message. He goes and shares the message. The message is well received. It doesn't cost him his life. They do what God has asked them to do. Like, everything. This is like a win-win for everyone involved. But this is actually how Jonah responds. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. And this isn't the righteous kind of anger. Jonah's not upset because of an atrocity he sees and a desire to do something about it. What Jonah is angry about is the fact that God didn't do what he wanted God to do. Like that the way this has all transpired is not really the vision that Jonah had for this moment. So as it does, he burns with anger because God didn't do what he wanted him to do. And I read this story, and whenever I come back to the story of Jonah, it resonates with me because I wonder how many of us do the same thing. Like, how many of us get angry because maybe God didn't do what we wanted God to do? Maybe we're angry because someone or didn't do what we wanted to do, or something didn't go as we wanted it to go. Like, how many of us find that our anger just burns inside of us because life didn't go as we wanted it to go? And when we can begin to peel back the layers, how much of that is rooted in our own arrogance, in our own pride? See, even though I can relate to Jonah's story, even though all of us can relate to Jonah's story, I think we would say we would actually like our stories to be different. That we would like to be the kind of people that don't find our lives filled with unrighteous anger. We'd like to be the kind of people who don't try to leverage our anger on God or to leverage our anger on the people that we love and care about the most. We want to be the kind of people, we've already said this, who live different, who act different, We want to be the kind of people that manage our anger differently than what the world has accepted as normal. But to do that, we really have to put some practices in place. To do that, we have to really put some guardrails up in our lives that help us in these moments kind of identify where the anger is coming from. These moments where we can kind of find some space to find clarity in our anger. And the truth is, as we even begin to talk about this, I want you to know that this is not going to change overnight. Like, I don't think you're going to wake up tomorrow and be like, I'm not angry anymore. Like, I think this is something that as you begin to put some of these principles in place, that you will find over time that you will become far more like what James calls us to be. That we will be the kind of people who can become slow to anger. But it will take discipline and it will take time. So here are these principles, 4 principles. The first one is this. Take a time out. Like, this isn't new. This is literally the same thing I said last week. Like, in these moments, whether it's something you're going to say or the reaction or response of your anger, you need to be willing to take a time out, to create some space. The truth is that each and every one of us has the ability to control our emotions, our responses. We have the ability to decide how it is that we respond in any given moment. But we can't, because so many of us don't take a time out to create the space to get some clarity to what we're actually experiencing in that moment. We don't take a time out to allow God to meet us in that moment to help us understand some of the things that we're wrestling with. The reality is, for all of us, anger has become such an automatic response that we don't even realize it's happening until it's happened. I mean, the truth is, it's not like we sit around and we think like, okay, in this moment, I am going to choose to get very angry. Like, especially when it comes to unrighteous anger, like, we don't make that decision. It just happens. It just seemingly just comes out of nowhere. And it's because we haven't broken the cycle. Because we haven't begun to identify and understand what this anger is about and where it's coming from, to then be able to separate ourselves from that emotional experience. The only way you can begin to do that is if you can discipline yourself to take a time out. And I don't know what this looks like for you. Maybe this means you got to count to 10. Maybe this means you take 5 deep breaths. Whatever it is, figure out a way to create some space, which will then allow you to do the second thing, which is this: admit it to God. Like, admit your feelings to God. Just tell him. Tell him what it is. Tell him what you're wrestling with. Tell him what you're feeling in that moment. Be willing to submit that to him. And I realize as I say that, like, for a lot of us, like, that whole concept might be foreign. Like, how do I tell God? How do I admit to God that I'm dealing with anger? How do I admit that to him? And so here's what I would do. Very, very simply, I would submit to you this prayer. And when you create some space, when you take a time out, praying this prayer is one of the ways you can discipline yourself to begin to admit your struggles to God. Say, God, I don't always know how to respond to emotional pain or rejection apart from anger. I mean, how much of this resonates with you? I mean, I know it resonates with me. God, I don't always know how to respond to emotional pain or rejection apart from anger. God, please show me a new way to handle these difficult situations. Help me make the changes that I need to prevent this from happening in the future. Just pray this prayer. If you have your phone out right now, just take a picture of the screen. Take a picture of the screen behind me. And we'll try to get this online later today. But after you take a time out, after you create some space, this prayer helps you admit your anger to God. And then the third step is this. It's to identify the source. What is it that is the cause of your anger? And the truth is that often it's not the person that you think it is. It's not the experience in that moment. These are the things that we blame for our anger, but the reality is for so many of us, the source of our anger is something else. It's in someplace else. It's in some experience from our childhood. It's some wounding from a previous relationship that continually manifests itself in our lives in so many other ways. This is one of the most difficult steps, but I believe it's absolutely critical if you're ever going to get control of your anger. If you're ever going to be the kind of person that can be slow to anger, you have to know the source. You have to know where it's coming from. And it's difficult because this forces us to look inward. It forces us to assess our lives and to look at our past and to look at our experience. But once we know truly where the source of our anger is coming from, then we can begin to control it. And so do the hard work. Identify the source of your anger. And then this is the last one. Simply this: give it to God. Once you know where it's coming from, surrender it to God. Trust Him. Know that God already knows what we're dealing with. God knows our struggle. He knows our negative feelings, and He wants to redirect that in our lives in positive behavior. God knows why you're angry. He knows our situation and circumstances. And so giving it to Him is trusting in Him to reveal to us the best way to manage this situation, the best way for us to let go of our anger. But this is difficult because this requires us to give over control. And the truth is that all of us like to believe that we are in control in our lives. But that is like the universal myth of humanity. We are not in control. No matter what you think, no matter what you've told yourself, you might be able to control maybe a small piece of your life, but ultimately in all of this, we have no control, that God is in control. And so giving it to Him is a recognition that it's actually His to begin with. See, that's partly what God is trying to get Jonah to understand. God's trying to teach Jonah something here. This is what God asked Jonah, so we get back to the story. God says, Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? Do you some way, somehow feel justified in your anger? Like, is it right for you to be upset that I would relent, that I would actually do something to restore, to not diminish or wipe out the people of Nineveh? Like, do you have any say in what I do? Like, do you think you are in control here, Jonah? And Jonah doesn't like the question. Matter of fact, Jonah doesn't even respond to the question. He completely, really ignores what God is asking him. And we're told that Jonah goes out of the city. And he finds a place, and he sits down in this place, and he looks back at the city of Nineveh, and he's literally waiting to see what's going to happen. It's almost like in this moment, Jonah's like, okay, God, like, yes, the people have turned their ways, but you know what? These people they're some pretty awful people. And maybe they'll be able to keep up the show for just a few minutes, but I'm pretty convinced, God, they're going to turn back to their evil ways, and then you're going to have to wipe out the city, and then I get to sit here and say, I told you so. Like, isn't that what so many of us want in our moments of anger? Like, aren't we just looking for that rationale or that reason just to justify why we're angry? That I told you so moment. And when it doesn't happen, we try to manufacture or create that moment just so we can justify why we're feeling the way that we feel. And it's like Jonah is doing the same thing. Jonah is sitting there just so he can say to God, I told you so, which is an awful place to be. Like, you never want to be in a place where you're like, God, I told you so. I was right, God. You were wrong. But that's what Jonah's waiting for. But now God's trying to teach Jonah something in this moment. So we're told that literally where Jonah's sitting, there is a leafy plant that sprouts out of the ground. And the leaves cover Jonah, and they provide shade for him to protect him from the sun. And then the next day, we're told that God sends a worm. And the worm eats at the root of the leafy plant, killing the plant, causing it to wither, which exposes Jonah to the harsh elements. And how do you think Jonah responded here? I mean, he's just more angry. He's just furious. He's so upset that God would do this. But look at what God's response is to Jonah. This is what he says to Jonah. You have been concerned about this plant. Though you did not tend it or make it grow, it sprang up overnight and died overnight. See, God's point is like, Jonah, you have done nothing. Like, you're not in control. Like, you didn't plant the seed. You didn't water the seed. You didn't cause it to grow. Like, nothing about this moment has anything to do with you. But in this moment, you feel justified in your anger when it's not yours to be justified to begin with. It's not your anger to have begin with, because you are not in control with any of this. As I read the story of Jonah, I think how differently this whole thing would have been if he would have leveraged some of those principles. Like when things started to go sideways, when God relented, what would it look like if Jonah just took a time out? And what would it have looked like if Jonah would have just admitted to God some of his anger? And then began to do the real work of identifying, well, where's this anger coming from? Like, why am I so untrusting? Why am I struggling to believe that what God wants to do is good and right? And then what would it look like for Jonah to literally surrender, to give to God everything he's angry about? I got to believe we wouldn't have had this second scene. We wouldn't see Jonah's anger continue to build. Because Jonah would have realized that the pathway forward from unrighteous anger is the path towards submission, of surrendering our anger at God's feet. See, here's the truth. The problem that we experience with unrighteous anger is this: that it's never rooted in anything that is worthy of the emotional energy it creates. That unrighteous anger is never rooted in anything that is worthy of the emotional energy it creates. We take all of this emotional power and we leverage it at someone or something. And it's rooted in our arrogance and pride. But I wonder, what would it look like if we could take that same emotional energy and leverage it to something entirely different? What if we said, okay, we're not going to be the kind of people that continually allow ourselves and our lives to be filled with unrighteous anger, but instead we're going to take that and use that power, to use that energy towards something good, to some cause that would bring about transformation in life, into our world that is so desperately needy of those two things. What would it look like if we could become the kind of people who were quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry? What difference could we make in other people's lives? What difference could we make in the world if we would do those three things? Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for the story of Jonah. God, I thank you that the Bible is filled with stories of normal people with incredible struggles. Because it's in those stories that we find ourselves, that we find connection, that their struggles resonate with our struggle. And it's like so many of us, we deal with unrighteous anger. But God, we don't want our lives to be marked by that behavior. So God, I pray that you would give us the strength and the capacity to begin to move beyond some of those things. That we would take a time out, that we would admit it to you, that we would identify the source of our anger, and then we would give it over to you. And God, freed from that, then we could leverage this emotional energy to something so much greater. So God, again, I pray that you give us the strength to do that you would help us identify some of the things in our world, some of the things that we could be part of the solution towards. God, use us and allow us to be people who want to undo a whole lot less and to do far more. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. As we wrap up our time together this morning, I just want to take a second. If you are a first-timer here with us at Lake Sawyer, I just want to say again, thank you for joining us. And as we wrap up our service, you can head over to the connection zone off to my left here. We have some staff there that would love to connect with you, meet you, and we do have a first-time gift for you, so stop by, and we'd love to see you there. Also want to make sure you know next week we're kicking off a brand new series. And when you came in this morning, on your seat was an invite card for our summer speaker series. And so we have this for you to have it be a tool to invite people to join us over the next 4 weeks. Over the next 4 weeks, we have some incredible speakers coming in that I'm just excited to be able to listen to, and I'm excited for them to be able to share with you. And so I just want to take a quick second to introduce a couple of them. Next week, Nate Roskam is a buddy of mine. We went to George Fox together as part of our doctoral studies. He works for an organization called Because International that uses innovative technology to really help come alongside kids in the developing world. And part of what they do is a nonprofit. They developed a cool product called Shoes That Grow that allows kids to grow into their shoes over their early childhood life. And so he's going to come. He's got a great message to share. And then the following week, Dan Shields, who's the lead pastor over at Valley Real Life in Spokane Valley, Washington. And I'm excited to have him. Dan and I partnered together and planted a church back in Arizona together. So it's going to be a blessing. And then week 3, Tracy Walsh, who's our student ministry pastor, is going to be sharing with us. And I know for a lot of our students, they've heard Tracy share before, but for us as adults, it's going to be a blessing to have Tracy join with us and share on a Sunday morning. And then we'll wrap up the series with Nathan Hawkins. Nathan works with Stadia, which is a church planting organization, doing some incredible things, not just planting churches here in the U.S., but globally. They planted over 150 churches last year, making an impact in people's lives. And so I'm excited to have Nathan here with us, and he's a Seattle guy, so he's not coming far. So it's going to be a great series next 4 weeks. Make sure you're here. You're not going to want to miss one of those weekends. I'm excited to be here and to listen to them as well. Guys, thank you so much, and have a wonderful week.